All right, hello and welcome everyone to today's City Futures seminar. My name is Dr. Sophie Maker, and I'm a research fellow and coordinator of our seminar series. I would like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present, and to First Nations people that are joining us today. We invite you to share the country that you're joining on in the chat box as we meet together online. A few quick housekeeping notes. Please mute your microphone and turn your camera off during the presentation. Once we get to the Q&A, you can use the raise hand function on Teams or type a question into the chat box for our panelists. So we have an excellent panel of presenters today who will explore how the availability and cost of rental properties drives rental policy and affects renters. And to introduce our speakers and give some context to the recently released report and today's presentation, I would now like to hand over to Jacqueline Phillips, who's ACOS Executive Director of Policy and Research.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Sophie
Jackie.
May. Thanks. And hello, everyone. Really nice to be here. So yes, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the Gadigal country. I'm in the ACOS office in Redfern here in Sydney with my colleague Penny, who is the project manager on the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. A little bit about that before we jump in. So the Poverty and Inequality Partnership is a research and impact partnership that ACOS has with UNSW and which is supported by a whole range of non-profit partners from the community social services sector. And really our mission is to monitor the extent and experience of poverty and inequality in Australia, and then to leverage that evidence to inform public debate and try and influence public policy. And we're very lucky to work with a team of really fantastic researchers at UNSW across the Social Policy Research Centre and also City Futures. And Chris Martin, who you're going to hear from today, is one of the collaborators at UNSW who we work with fairly regularly through the partnership, and it's been a great supporter of that. So to introduce Chris to talk about one of the latest reports from the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. Chris is a housing researcher, for those who don't know him, and he has a special interest in rental housing and in tenancy law in particular. And I know that's a major focus for many of the organisations and academics on the webinar today. Chris has led and participated in numerous inquiries and research projects for AHURI, for the ARC, and for the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. I'm going to add that into your bio, Chris. And current projects include an AHURI project on lodging houses and an ARC project on rental vulnerability. And many of you would probably know that prior to this role, Chris worked at the Tenants Union of New South Wales, so comes from our sector, and I think understands the sector policy and advocacy really well, which I think is what makes the partnership work so effectively too. And is a past chair of Shelter New South Wales. So Chris is the lead author of this report from the partnership, Rights at Risk, Rising Rents and Repercussions, the Experience of Renting in Australia. I will hand to him now to present on the key findings of that report, and then we will move into a panel discussion and then audience Q&A. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Jackie. I'll just get the slides up on my screen. And yours, I hope. Let me know if there's a problem.
Perfect.
There it is. Great. Thanks again for having me. I'll pay my respects to the Dharawal people whose country I'm joining you from today. Rights at Risk, Rising Rents and Repercussions is the report that we're talking about. As Jackie said, it's a report that colleagues of mine with me here at City Futures did for the ACOS UNSW Poverty and Inequality Partnership. We were fortunate to be supported by National Shelter and the National Association of Renters Organisations in doing the report. If you want to Google ACOS Poverty and Inequality and you'll find the report. Look for it's one of a series, look for the one with the cute baby on the cover. The report was in two parts. One's a review of published data about the private rental sector, particularly over the last 5 tumultuous years. And the second part was a survey of private rental sector renters throughout Australia. We interviewed just over 1,000. So first part first. This is a review of the published data, particularly the quantitative data about the private rental sector since the pandemic. There's more in the report than this, but I'll focus in particular on the extraordinary increases in rents that we've seen over the past 5 years. This is the chart showing two things, showing the extraordinary increase in asking rents. That's rents for new tenancies commencing. That's the blue line, and also rents measured by in the CPI, which is rents for both new and existing tenancies, and extraordinary increases in both those on both those metrics over the last 5 years, including a small decrease at the beginning of the pandemic period, but from really late 2021 on, a really extraordinary increase, especially in asking rents. This chart is showing the rate of change year on year in rents. So although we're on the downward slope now, but that's still rents are rising. It's just that they're not rising at the extraordinary rate of 20% a year that we saw a couple of years ago. This is another chart about rent increases, psychedelic chart, I'm afraid, but it's something we don't see very often. It comes from the ABS, and it's about rent increases just in existing tenancies. So as well as there being some, as we saw, extraordinary movements in the new tenancy market when people are looking for a new place to rent, we have seen extraordinary rent increases, both in terms of the prevalence of rent increases and in the size of rent increases within tenancies during the term of during the period of a tenancy, and that's what we're seeing in the chart here. So just to explain it, prior to in the years prior to the start of the pandemic, most tenancies didn't have a change in the rent during the year. That's represented by the yellow block, and a few had higher rent increases and had either 0 to 5% or 5 to 10, light blue or red. Very few had rent increases within the year of more than 10%. But look to say late 23, early 24, and about 30% of tenancies are getting rent increases. More than 30% of tenancies are had a rent increase of more than 10% in the past year, and very few tenancies had no change at all. So in the most recent year, say a quarter of tenants last year had a rent increase of more than 25%. Looking at other market conditions, we're seeing low vacancy rates. They declined from the beginning of the pandemic and have stayed quite low since then. And just to show the relationship to rents, I've flipped that vacancy rate over upside down in the next chart, and you can see how it maps quite closely onto what's happening, what happened to median rents in the new tenancy market. I'm highlighting a couple of charts here, this one and the next, about factors that are often put forward as explaining or as being causative of rent increases. And I'm putting them forward to suggest that there's it's a little more complicated than people often make out. So we have seen extraordinary movements in net overseas migration in the recent period. We did see, and this is the light blue line in the chart, we saw a big decrease in the early years of the pandemic, and we've seen a steep increase since then. Although, if that blue line continues the way it is going, it's really the later increase is going to largely just make up for that decline in net overseas migration that we saw for a time. The relationship to rent increases is more commonly more complicated than is often put forward, though, because as you can see there, rents were increasing before net overseas migration turned up again, and we also had that decrease in rents, but it's of much smaller scale than the subsequent increase. So it's a more complicated relation, and it can't explain all of everything that's happened in rents than in the last few years. Another complicated relationship with rents is interest rates, which are often, as we can see in the chart here, again, it's the light blue line, interest rates, and this is the interest rates for investors that the RBA publishes. So it started taking off in mid 22 after the low pandemic settings. But as you can see again, rents were rising before that. It's often put out in media that the interest rates are just getting passed on by landlords to renters, but rents were rising before that. Landlords were increasing rents before that, and it may be that interest rates have since then been a convenient justification for further increases, but it's not a straightforward relationship that the data would suggest. And here's another interesting thing that we're seeing in the published data, and that is this is looking at the total of rental bonds that are held, and we're taking that as a proxy for the number of private rental tenancies. Over the period, we've seen low growth in the total number of private rental tenancies in New South Wales, and we've even seen declines at points in time in Victoria and in Queensland, so a contraction of the private rental sector. That's not necessarily a bad thing in itself. In fact, you might think it's a good thing. It also means there are fewer landlords and probably more people getting into home ownership. So that's something that I think we need to keep in mind, that over this tumultuous period of really high rents and tight vacancies, we have also seen more people getting into home ownership, and that's another complication of the housing outcome story of the last few years. I'll go over the survey component of the project now. So the survey was administered by the market research company Qualtrics. It was in the field last year in November. We had over 1,000 respondents. They were all private renters, all from across Australia. When we analysed the data, we weighted it by the profile of private renters by age and gender in each state and territory. And also, as you'll see in the report, we had a focus on different poverty and inequality groups, and that's the list of them there on the right. There's an important group missing from that list, and that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, who we couldn't put a focus on them in the report, we decided, because in our survey responses, we actually had a surprisingly large response from respondents who said that they were Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, like disproportionately large. So those responses are still in, but we just felt that we couldn't, because it was such a disproportionately large response, that we couldn't put that forward as being indicative or representative of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander experiences of private rental. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at the report. But otherwise, we've for all of our responses, we've broken them down by these various groups who we know we're going to have more likely to have some sorts of issues in private rental, and the survey shows indeed they do. So we asked about rent increases in the past year, and we found of our respondents, 64% of those who'd been in their tenancy for more than a year, 64 said they'd had a rent increase in the past year. That compares to 73% in that ABS data, that the psychedelic chart that I flashed up on the screen before. So our group, it's in the ballpark, but our group slightly less likely to have a rent increase in the past year, but still 64%, most had. Half had one increase, and worryingly, 14% said they had more than one. That's particularly a worry because in most states and territories, one is the legal limit. So some people are saying that they've had more. Rent increases, interestingly, were more prevalent amongst renters renting from agents, 73%, which is on line with the ABS figure. More prevalent amongst renters renting from agents than from landlords directly. And here's a couple of breakdowns by the length of time people have been renting, and also by those poverty and inequality groups on the right. And you can see that for a lot of those groups, they'd been getting increases at a greater rate even than the total for all Australia, which is the rightmost set of columns on the chart. So people who are unemployed, people who are tenants with disability, they all had higher rates of copying and rent increase in the last year than the average renter did. We also asked about what they felt their ability was to afford a 5% rent increase in the coming year. 5% being somewhat less than the CPI rent increase trend of the last few years. 39% said they could afford it comfortably or very comfortably. 27% said just able to afford it, and 34% said it would be difficult or very difficult to afford that kind of rent increase. 5%, less than what's been happening in past years in the coming year. And again, that, as you might expect, that breaks down quite differently by the different poverty and inequality groups, also by length of current tenancy, and that reflects, as you can see on the left, the chart on the left, that would reflect people who have recently agreed to a tenancy. They're the ones who have been copping those huge asking rents of the last few years, and most of them say that it would be difficult or very difficult to afford a further increase of 5% in the coming year. That's in the chart on the left. And as you can see in the chart on the right, the light blue line being difficult or very difficult to afford, that feeling is much higher for most of our groups, especially for unemployed tenants, than for all renters, again, the rightmost on the chart. We asked our participants about their feelings of security and insecurity, and I'll make a couple of points. I'll highlight a few things, including things that surprised us and that need to be kept in mind in interpreting the results. So over 80% of survey respondents said they had a fixed term tenancy agreement, which seems a bit high to me. We also had just 19% saying they'd received a no grounds notice at some stage in their renting history. And that seems low to me. We also had about 50% saying in response to our question, do you feel secure and not worried about having to move? 51% said, yeah, they do feel very secure and do not worry about having to move. And that, again, surprises me that it's 50%, that it's high, surprisingly high. That might reflect that that surprisingly high feeling of insecurity, I think, reflects that we happen to get quite a lot of renters who have fixed term agreements, and they're probably thinking about, in the fixed term, I feel secure. Nonetheless, 42% said they felt they could assert their tenancy rights and not worry, and that's pretty good. It still means most tenants aren't quite that assured. 37% said they could raise an issue, but they would still worry about it. 16% they'd be reluctant, and 6% said they wouldn't at all because it's just too risky. So they're actually, to me, they're surprisingly sanguine or confident results around security, but put them in perspective, it's still, most people have a worry about, at least have a worry about asserting their rights. And furthermore, those feelings of security started to wane a bit when we asked them further questions about the consequences of raising issues, and we'll get to that in a sec. Again, breaking down by the poverty and inequality groups, we see that results are quite different for some groups from the overall result. People born overseas, and again, people who are unemployed, also, yeah, particularly people who are unemployed kept getting a much worse results, much more anxious and worried results than anyone else in the survey. And just quickly now on dwelling conditions, half of people we survey said that their dwelling needed some sort of repair, and 10% said it was an urgent thing that they were experiencing, urgent repair need. 3/4 said that during their tenancy they'd experienced some sort of issue, whether it's a defect, annoyance, or something else. And that's they're represented there on the chart. So we started asking about if you were to ask for repairs, you know, what are your concerns about the consequences? And particularly, could it lead to a rent increase? Could it lead to being evicted? Could it lead to being blacklisted? And yeah, so that's those strong results on security, surprisingly strong results on security, start to wane a bit here. We've got almost 70% of people saying they'd be at least slightly concerned, maybe moderately concerned, or very concerned about a rent increase coming after a repair request. Doing a bit better as regards eviction or being blacklisted on a tenancy database, but still, most people had some level of concern. Those bars on the right add up to being most people had some concern about those sorts of consequences. So that's it in summary. Most people have had a rent increase. A good third of people would find a further rent increase in the coming year very difficult to afford, difficult or very difficult to afford. About half feel secure against having to move, but less than half say they could assert their rights without worrying about repercussions. 3/4 have experienced a defect. Half say that their dwelling needs repair, and most express some level of concern about that asking for a repair could result in some sort of repercussion, and worse results for generally for the groups. Especially unemployed and low education also came out as a group that had much more worried and negative outcomes on a bunch of scores. So conclusions. The finding support calls that all the organisations involved in the report have made for law reform limiting the rate and not just the frequency of rent increases. For example, a 3% per annum speed limit on rent increases during tenancies. Law reform to improve security, noting that there has been law reform to improve tenant security in about half of Australian states and territories over the last few years. So that also points to the need for enhanced resources to tenants' advice services to inform people about the rights they do have and to help resource them and support them in asserting them. It also points to the poverty and inequality group findings point to the need for increased income support payments, especially job seeker, because of the much worse outcomes that unemployed people in particular are reporting. More social housing as an alternative to private rental that poorly serves low-income groups, but also I think going back to the first point, some more consideration and more thinking about the housing supply implications of shifts in tenure share. So especially if we're seeing more policies and programs and perhaps more opportunities for people to get into owner occupation, that may have, I think that has implications for how housing supply is used and occupied. And although we might say that more people having access to home ownership is generally a good thing, there could be some supply implications of that need to be thought through as well. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm really thrilled now to be able to introduce the panelists to join Chris in a conversation about the implications of that research. So today we're joined by Eloise Parab and Thomas Chayu. Eloise joins us from the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and she has stood in at the last minute. Thank you, Eloise, for Leo Patterson-Ross, who unfortunately was not able to join us today. And Thomas joins us from Shelter, New South Wales. So it was very remiss of me, and I've done this a few times now, not to acknowledge our key partners in this report, which were the National Association of Tenants Organisations, NARO, of which Tenants Union of New South Wales is a key member. And a National Shelter, of which obviously Shelter New South Wales is a key member. So we have representatives from those two organisations today on the panel. So we're going to move into a conversation. I will pose some questions to the panelists and to Chris, and then we'll have some time towards the end to open out for audience questions. In the interim, if there are questions you want to post in the chat, by all means, do that. And I note that there have been some comments in the chat, and I think Chris has touched a little bit on some of the findings around migration in his presentation. We were very mindful of the sensitivities and risks about analysing the impacts of migration in this work, and our commitment was, let's make sure that the work that we do is fact-based, but also brings perspective to the role that migration plays vis-a-vis all of the other structural drivers of affordability issues in the housing market, and of which migration is certainly not the major driver. So I'll start by introducing Eloise. So Eloise, as I said, works with the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and has been working in that network for over 20 years. That's amazing, Eloise. She has extensive experience assisting renters to understand and navigate the rental system, in New South Wales. She's worked in advocacy officer and land lease communities officer roles within the network, and is passionate about making sure that renters have access to safe, secure and affordable housing. And Thomas is a social justice advocate and public policy professional. He leads the policy and law reform work for Shelter New South Wales, and has lots of experience working with peak bodies and CLCs and community orgs, and people, of course, with lived experience of homelessness and housing insecurity. So I might give them a kind of easy opening question just to get going, and I assume that we'll be able to now see them join the panel on our screens. Which is to say, and we might start with you, Eloise. Firstly, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of key priorities for your organisation, the perspective you bring, but then to reflect, I guess, in the first instance about what struck you most listening to Chris and having looked at the report, about the report's findings and its policy implications for the tenants' union.
Sure. So the Tenants Union, we're the peak body representing the interests of renters across New South Wales, and we're really focused on ensuring that renters do have access to safe, secure and affordable homes. And we do that by supporting and being the main resourcing body for the Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service network, which is across New South Wales. And we also run training for tenant advocates, and we do a lot of work in terms of trying to improve renting law, policy and practice so that renters do have a better experience of renting in New South Wales. I think for us, the report findings kind of really solidify what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis and hearing from renters across New South Wales in terms of their experience of the rental, especially the private market system. So we're definitely hearing that rents are increasingly unaffordable. And here in New South Wales, security of housing has been a key issue. Obviously, we've had the change to the legislation back in May, which is welcome, with the end of no grounds terminations in New South Wales. Obviously, very early days in terms of that change being implemented here, but we are hopeful that that will give tenants in New South Wales more confidence to assert their rights in terms of disputing rent increases and ensuring that their homes are safe and livable to live in. So the rent increases, though, is a big area of concern, and it's an area of focus. And we're definitely calling, along with other organisations, for there to be some caps on rent increases. So we've now obviously got limits on the frequencies of rent increases across all states and territories in Australia. But what we're really lacking is a cap on those rent increases, so that it's not up to the tenants to have to constantly be disputing excessive rent increases.
And so, Eloise, in terms of the current rules, just so everybody's across where we are now, the limits on the frequency, what are those? I imagine there's some variation between the states and territories, but broadly speaking, what's the sort of spectrum of what's possible?
So the majority of states and territories have a limit to once every 12 months the rent can be increased, but there are some states and territories that's allowed in the 6 months as well.
Okay.
ACT is the one territory where there's an actual cap on the rent increase, and there's a formula that applies there.
And there is a question about that, which we might go to while we've got you, Eloise, on this topic, which is how and why the 3% speed limit was arrived at. I thought it was because it related to kind of CPI or the rent inflation component at that time. But that's part of the question, and whether it's tied to any kinds of improvements in the dwelling, which I don't think so is the answer, but defer to you, Eloise.
So I wasn't part of the developing of that, but I do understand it is tied to CPI and inflation. In ACT, the formula that they have, which is a rent cap, is tied to CPI. So I believe that was the thinking behind that, but Chris probably has a better response. And in terms of it being tied to improvements in the house, it wouldn't be tied to that. But I guess, like in the ACT, if the landlord wants to increase the rent higher than what's allowed by that cap, then they can go to the tribunal and put forward an argument that they should be allowed a higher increase. So there's the potential for that to be there as well. But importantly, it puts the onus on the landlord, whereas at the moment in New South Wales, the onus is on the tenant to dispute a rent increase is excessive, which there are a lot of systemic and individual barriers to tenants taking that action.
Thanks, Eloise. Chris, did you want to comment on that too?
Yeah, sure. Like Eloise has indicated, there's different ways you could regulate the rate of rent increases. 3%, I suggested 3% because it's the top of the target inflation band for the RBA. That's so why not join the landlords of Australia in the effort to bring inflation to that point? So and also it is simpler. It is simpler to say a specific number, 3%. Although you could also have a CPI cap, or you could have something like the ACT, which is this softer cap of CPI plus a little bit, and then you can go over if you make an argument to try.
Right.
Yeah, different ways of doing it. This one's simple and in keeping with broader policy around inflation.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, Thomas, we'll go to you. So same question really, which is, I think the perspective that Shelter brings to these debates, and then I suppose what struck you most about the research findings and their policy implications. Thanks, Thomas.
Sure. So a little bit about National Shelter. We operate as a network of individual organisations. We have shelter in every jurisdiction except Victoria, where we work with the National Sydney and Nepal Society. And our focus is mostly on people living on lower incomes, so the first two quintiles of income earners. Our vision is for everyone to have access to safe, secure, affordable, high-quality housing. And I think in the context of this report, we recognise that even though our main objective remains for government to invest directly in the supply and management of social housing, to provide a bit of a benchmark to the market and to provide that housing security and that housing affordability to most of the lower income earners who have been failed really by the private rental market in the last few decades, if not more. There is a recognition from National Shelter that this will also happen through the private rental market, because we will not be able to provide social and affordable housing to every person living on lower incomes. And so for us, it's about recognizing that everyone has housing security and has access to a good home, and that requires adequate regulation. In more simple terms, I think it's about making renting fair. And we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And I think the report really shows that there has been some legislative change, in particular around the grounds eviction. But we need to go further on law reform, and we also need to have cultural change so that people who rent their home are respected and valued and they get a good deal. I think that currently renters are doing it tough. There is some level of comfort, some level of flexibility that's appreciated by renters, as we can see in the report, but we can do better. There's also a lot of concerns around rent increases, around being able to assert their rights, especially for people who are facing various forms of disadvantage. So for us, this report is an encouragement to go further and continue to ask for law reform and for policies to support renters around minimum standards, including energy efficiencies, no grounds, and better regulation of rent increases, not just of the frequency, but also of the amount that we've talked a little bit about already.
Yeah, and I want to just go to that trend, the trend of increasing rent increases. I was really struck by that just listening anew to these findings today, Chris, and into the panel's thoughts about why that's happening and whether, if policy settings remain unchanged, we'd expect that to continue to happen. I know you touched, Chris, on the role of interest rates as well, and there might be further comments to make about that, but just interested in perspectives on what's driving that. Who wants to kick off?
I'm happy to go first.
Thanks, Eloise.
So I think lack of social housing is a key factor in terms of what's pushing the rents up and increasing them, because there's such high demand for the private rental market. Obviously, as Chris has highlighted, the biggest increases we see are in between tenancies, when really landlords know that demand is at its highest and renters are in desperate need and they're being forced to compete. So that's an opportune moment to do those big increases. I think also that lack of social housing means that very low renters are being forced to try and find housing in the private rental market, which creates a lot of demand at that lower level and allows landlords really to have that huge competition in terms of offering rents for properties when they're being applied.
Yeah. Thomas or Chris, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree that the lack of social housing is an important factor, but I'd also say it's the lack of regulation, lack of transparency. We know that rent bidding has been banned in some jurisdictions, but there is a lot of rent bidding that still occurs, whether it's illegal or whether it's because it's unsolicited rent bidding, and that is still permitted in some regulations. So really, as Eloise has said, we have this situation where renters are competing with each other to get a product that's often not adequate as well. I'd like to mention as well that when we talk about rent increases, we also need to look at the quality and the adequacy of the housing that people access, because there are people who are maybe able to afford a rent increase, or they are able to afford their current rent, but they've compromised on other things. From very serious situations where people are unable to leave a domestic and family violence situation, for example, all the way to compromising on other life's essential, and that's an impact on quality of life and on productivity as well, which I think is quite topical at the moment.
Yeah. And Chris, I mean, if interest rates continue to come down, would we expect to see some, at least amelioration in the growth of rents, or is it that whatsoever demand is this high and supply is as constrained as it is, this trend likely to continue because landlords can?
Yeah. The relationship to interest rates is interesting and contested. So, we've yet to see a landlord sending out a letter saying your rent's going, because my interest bill has gone down, your rent's going to go down as well. Although you see we do see the opposite, and it's interesting whether interest rates like really drive that, or whether another interpretation could be that interest rate increases are an opportunity for landlords, particularly landlords with agents, and most of them do have agents, to coordinate around that and to push to try to move the market and push a rent increase, because they've got this plausible story about rising costs and things like that. So I think that more work needs to be done on that question, because the conventional economic answer to it is that as interest rates go down, like you said, Jackie, then that should mean more money in people's pockets, more money for people to spend on goods and services and buildings, increased employment of renters and renter incomes, and that should mean higher rents. But it's not a straightforward relationship like that. And I think that in particular, the power of agents in this is overlooked and something that needs to be examined. I just mentioned, because Thomas brought up the rent bidding thing, and that's something, I mean, you can absolutely imagine it, and you probably don't need to imagine it. You'll have heard of it happening. You may have done it yourself. If you went looking for a property, a new tenancy in that really low vacancy rate period that we still haven't come out of, people very well might, applicants themselves, offer something more and bid up the rent, and that could be part of the rising new tenancy rent story. It's not part of the the story of rent increases during tenancies. Tenants don't do that. I mean, that's landlords. That's landlords seeing what's happening in the new tenancy market and pushing up rents for existing tenants. So landlords drive increases.
Yes. And just so everyone understands the rules around rental bidding, so is it right to say, so it's banned in some but not all jurisdictions, is that right? Or is it only the soliciting of it that's banned, i.e. the agents encouraging or inviting it? And that could be Eloise or Thomas jumping in here if Chris, this might not be Chris's.
Most jurisdictions now ban soliciting of rent increases from landlords and agents. Queensland and I think Victoria, I'm not sure that the Victorian rules have commenced yet, but Queensland and Victoria have gone further and said you just can't, landlords and agents just can't take
More than
even an unsolicited rent.
I was going to say
Okay.
that's our
Rental
recommendation, is that
Yes.
it should actually be prescribed that the lease being entered to is entered at the price that the property was at.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Then my next question was, and then we'll open up to the audience, I think, at that point for the rest. But I was just thinking about that trend that the groups that are the most disadvantaged in the rental market are also the ones who are experiencing the most regular rent increases. And I just wanted to unpack that a bit more and why the panelists think that is. I mean, is that about the kinds of premises that are being rented, the terms of the lease, for example, them being shorter and, potentially, or the power disparity between those particularly disadvantaged tenants and landlords, or some other feature of the market or less regulated end of the market, perhaps, that those tenants tend to be in? Maybe, I don't know, Eloise, if you want to comment on that, or Thomas in the first instance.
I think the power imbalance has a big part to play in terms of those kind of rent increases at the lower end of the market. So we've often got very disadvantaged renters who are renting in the lower end of the market, and obviously affordability for them, they're already stretched to the absolute limit. And so when they do get that rent increase, they're probably a lot more hesitant to potentially try and dispute that in the tribunal, because obviously they then run the risk potentially of getting a termination notice. So I think that perhaps plays a big part in terms of those people's ability to be able to find another property and move quite easily. It's really limited.
Yeah, look, it's always complex to answer that question because we talk about the housing market, but there are dozens of housing markets in Australia, if not hundreds. But what I think is that perhaps because some of those dwellings were rented at a relatively low price points, you then are seeing a bigger increase as a percentage of the initial rent, and perhaps also because landlords are now testing the market in a sense with interest rate increases. They feel like it's a good time to go and try to collect a higher rent from those lower price point properties, whereas at other more premium sort of ends of the market, it may be more difficult to raise the rent. And back to that power imbalance, you may run the risk of the tenant deciding to leave and then losing your return, maybe not for the year in the Thai market, but for a relatively long periods. Whereas in other situations, landlords might be able to guess that their tenants have very little chance of getting another property and that they'll make every effort they can to stay.
True.
One of the,
sorry, Chris.
I didn't include the chart, but it is in the report. One of that shows one of the key long-term trends in Australian private rental sector is over decades, since the late 90s, you can see the number of low-cost properties declining absolutely, and sort of the most popular price point in the private rental market moving up the rental scale. So the sort of the low cost properties that low income households especially need have been dropping out of the rental sector for years. The rate at which they're dropping out actually slowed between the last couple of censuses, slowed between the last two censuses. Whether what we've seen in housing markets since 21 has caused them to those low cost properties to again drop out at a high rate. I think that's plausible because we have seen, as I say, we have seen a bit of an uptick in owner occupation, and it may be that those lower cost rental properties are being sold and to a new group of owner occupiers who are moving into them and doing them up and things. But the low cost stock that has been that low income households need has been in shortening supply for many years, and that may have picked up again in the last couple of years.
Yeah. So please do, raise your hand if you've got a question or pop it in the chat. So a couple of years ago, the government's all collectively signed the Better Deal for Renters. So why are we still here, and why haven't we seen more changes? Does anyone want to comment on that? And then we've got someone with their hand up, which is great.
I think what we've seen is a very different approach to implementing the Better Deal for Renters across all the states and territories. Some states and territories have done a lot, and others have really fallen behind. And I think the reason for that is that there really hasn't been a national kind of push towards implementing the reforms. So we had the plan released 2 years ago, and then it's kind of been left up to states and territories to do the work to implement them, and there's not really been a kind of a national program focused on implementing it, I guess, equitably and fairly across Australia. So I think, yeah, that's an issue with how it's been kind of rolled out.
And of course, there were some gaps in it to start with too, like the caps on the amount that rents could be increased, as you've already alluded to.
I agree,
Thomas.
Jackie. Yeah, I was going to add to that, saying that National Shelter did not plan on stopping at the Better Deal for Renters.
Yeah.
We were not consulted in the development of this policy. We welcomed it. It was a great first step.
Yeah.
But there are many things that are missing from the Better Deal for Renters, like regulation of the quantum of increases, but also better standards around energy efficiency, for example.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I think we've got a question from Mary Beth, if you want to put your camera on, Mary, or not, however you feel comfortable.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi,
what's your question?
So I'm from Gisborne in Victoria, and I've got a question for, and I didn't get I wasn't available for all of Chris Martin's report about the research, but I was just interested in finding out whether you considered in the research whether the participants or those that were completing the data survey were how long they'd been housed for or unhoused. In particular, we have somebody living in the centre of town here. I'm from a very small town, who is living in a tent and has been doing so for months and has been joined by a number of other tents, people in tents. And I've also experienced long-term that lack of housing. And so I was just really interested, because I think being able to report problems with housing or being able to engage with landlords when you haven't been housed for some time, there's quite a lot of problems with that. The other thing I was also interested in is, have you considered, I understand that moving houses is really, I've talked to people all the time who rent, women over 50, that's my cohort, and they are constantly either there for a couple of years and they move due to a sale, or they move because the owner's quite elderly. And this seems to be a common story amongst them all, but also the hidden cost of moving. So moving vans, time taken off work, time engaged with trying to find somewhere else, the time that you have to sit on the internet, the time that you have to deal with real estate agents, all of that, all of those resources. It's sort of like, well, you're a at-home carer or parent, or and that's not necessarily considered as work these days. Well, this is actually work, and I'm unemployed, so it's all very costly. So I was just wondering about those.
No, they're good,
really.
Good questions. Thanks, Marybeth. So on the survey, who was in the survey? Chris can answer that, but it was really focused around the private rental market. That's what we wanted to examine, what was the experience of renters in the private rental market. So, Chris, did you want to speak to who then was included and who excluded from the survey sample?
It was private renters. So everyone who's in it are people who, at the time of the survey, have a tenancy, a private market tenancy. We didn't ask about previous experience of homelessness, but I think that's the other things you mentioned, Marybeth, around the cost of moving. Isn't that's going to be a reason why particularly low-income households are going to feel like they're just going to have to suck it up in their current tenancy because of the cost of moving. I the other thought I had was that just colleagues of mine, including Hal and Chris Hartley, who are on this project with me, they're also involved in the Homelessness Monitor, another piece of research that is more squarely on homelessness, and you can find that on our website too.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm conscious I'm supposed to be handing back now to Sophie May, but let's just do one more question. And I can never only see your initial. Oh, there we go, Susan.
Yes, hello. Thomas mentioned briefly the benefits of landlords who want to maintain long-term tenancies and sustain tenancies rather than keep churning through tenants. I'm wondering, is there any action, campaign, lobbying, education programs, maybe via the Real Estate Institute, to encourage landlords to keep tenants long term? I'm fortunate that I live in a block with a landlord. It's changed hands a few times, but I mean, we have tenants here who've been here nearly 30 years. Yeah. Because it was a landlord who wanted just a slow, steady investment income and not chasing, as he said to me. I mean, he's sold now, he's a very old man, but he said to me, you know, it's the problem is that these days they're all chasing the quick buck. Yeah. And it's not sustainable for anyone in the long term. And I'm just wondering if there's any action around that.
So I think education can only go so far, and you cannot ask landlords to have stable tenants out of the goodness of their hearts, so to speak. I think what we need to do is redesign the tax system and the legislation to make sure that landlords then do the maths and realize that it is in their interest to have stable long-term tenants. And I think one of the ways we need to do that is to reduce the discount for capital gains taxes, making sure that people are not looking for that quick bucks where they are negatively geared for a few years, and as soon as they become positively geared, they will then sell the property to make that money. So I think it's tax reform, and then it's legislative reform, making sure that no grounds, for example, and including even perhaps sale of the property, are not prescribed grounds for people to evict tenants, which is not currently the case. Reform has not gone that far. So I'll keep it short.
Thanks, Thomas. And then, of course, I think there's also thought about what role institutional investors might play who are in for a longer term, more stable return. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. I've gone over 3 minutes over. So back to you, Sophie May.
Thank you, Jackie. And yeah, unfortunately, we have reached the end of today's seminar. So I also wanted to extend my thanks to Chris, Eloise and Thomas for your insights and for the important work that you do and your organisations do. And also thank the team at ACOS and City Futures who have helped coordinate today's seminar, especially Penny, Parry and Georgia, as well as thank everyone who has joined us online for this really important discussion. So some links have been shared earlier in the chat box for everybody to access the report and see these findings in more detail. Our next seminar will be held in a fortnight on Thursday, the 31st of August, again at 1:30, and we'll hear from Dr. Laura Go, who will present on Beyond Planning, looking at regulatory barriers to collaborative housing, which promises to be another great presentation, and we hope to see lots of you there. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon.